Hi, I'm Dexter, and that's Tom, and we're from All I.T. And if you'd like to know more about us and what we do, you can visit allit.services. And today, for a segment that we've not actually labeled yet, this is actually an interview, the first of its kind for us. We're not quite sure what to call it. We'll think of a name at some point. We were talking about maybe Be Like Mike or Origin Stories. Anyway, basically, Tom and I just want to highlight awesome individuals that have done some extraordinary things. So what sort of extraordinary things are we talking about here? Well, let me see. I've had to write this down because I'm not going to memorize all of this. We have successful business owner. We have Olympian. We have member of the Order of Australia. We have former chief executive to a number of companies, including the Western Bulldogs. So please stick with me after hearing that. We also have former chief executive to a multi-billion-dollar company called VicTrack. On top of that, he's super smart, super fun to chat with, and Tom and I are going to pick his brains for everything he knows. Please welcome Campbell Rose. Hey, Cam, thank you very much, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dexter and Tom. Be pleased to be a part of this.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically pepper questions to you, find out what it is that makes you tick, find out the mettle of a person that can lead a multi-billion-dollar company, 500 plus employees, because certainly I don't know what it takes. Tom may have a bit more of an idea, but unfortunately I don't. So Tom, if you've got any line of questioning that you want to ask Cam, by all means. Otherwise, I've got a whole bag here ready and waiting to go.
Yeah, well, I think, Cam, take us back to, people like to start at the start. I know it's an obvious one, but tell us a little bit about your early days and where you grew up and some of your family life, and we'll start there.
Sure. Well, look, I'm a Melbourneian through and through, Victorian to my heart, although I've worked outside Victoria quite extensively, both overseas and in Brisbane. Family of five. My father was a doctor, three elder sisters, I should say, and a younger brother. All have been successful in their own way. And I finished very luckily. My parents supported all of our siblings to go through private schools. My sisters went through Merton Hall. I went through Melbourne Grammar with my brother. Finished in 1982, went on and did a bachelor's degree in science at the then Footscray Institute of Technology with a specialisation in biomechanics and exercise physiology. Nothing related to what I've achieved or what I've done subsequently in my life. And as a part of that, very fortunate, my grandfather was an Olympian in 1952 and then 1956, Helsinki and Melbourne. And I don't know, I got the sailing bug. My dad was a sailor and he introduced me to it. And I set my eyes, if you like, or my focus on wanting to try and achieve that goal, which then successfully went on to sailing in many international, state, national and international events. And I was good at it. I probably wasn't the best, to be frank. There were others out there who could always seem to be able to get a little bit ahead of me, but that led to my selection in 1988 after doing a whole bunch of regattas, including sailing in the America's Cup in 1987 it was. It's a long time ago now.
Wow.
86, 87 in Perth, the Defence, which we lost. So I contributed to that loss from that great event in 1983 that brought the America's Cup to Australia, sailing on a boat called Steak and Kidney from Sydney, championed by Sid Fisher. And then I went on to be selected as reserve to the 1988 Seoul yachting Olympic team or sailing team. So that's a bit of my background. And then in between, I've fitted in work and various other bits and pieces, which has led to where I am now, some close to 60 years on.
We'll get to that, Cam, but take us back to what I often find interesting in a number of origin stories and chats with people that I listen to, and I listen to a lot of them, is the formative years, growing up, and, what were the key defining moments, and people. It generally always comes back to people, right? It's whether it's your parents and I'll ask about some of the formative sort of people that have guided you in the latter stages of your life. But was it your parents? You obviously, grew up in a quite a successfully, by the sounds of it, academic family. You had the opportunities at foot that a lot of people don't. But you still obviously have had in those formative years, and I'm talking right from birth, right through into those early stages. Talk us through, your parents and how they guided you through those early years.
Yeah, well, I think, look, I was really fortunate to go to a private school. I mean, you can't underestimate what that provides in terms of access to facilities, quality of education, focus of the institution on the individual. I was never a star at school. I wasn't the smartest knife in the drawer by any means. And what that taught me, and go back to the formative years, is that if you don't apply yourself, you won't get anywhere. You can be put in the very best environment, you can have the best tools, but if you don't use them well and apply yourself with them or to that environment as best you can with whatever skills or tools you've got, then you won't make the most of it. And I learned that very quickly at grammar, and I learned that primarily through sport. I, as a Melburnian and Victorian, was unusual. I didn't play AFL footy. I was probably not coordinated enough to do that. Growing up, I broke my elbow at a very early age, which made it difficult to get hand-eye coordination, probably with just the combination of adolescence. So I went on and played rugby union, which was an unusual sport, although quite popular amongst some of the private schools. And I realised that, I had a bit of a niche there. I was strong, I was broad-shouldered, I was relatively fast. I had matured fairly quickly, probably a bit more quickly than others. And
what position, Cam?
I
Where'd
was
you play?
loose head forward. So,
Right.
yeah, in the front row.
Yep.
So a pretty brutal place to be. And that taught me, if you don't apply yourself, you'll just get run over, literally run over.
In the physical sense, yeah, yep.
Oh, yeah, in every sense. And so that was probably the beginnings of this drive to make the most out of what I had and the environment in which I was in. And I think also my grandfather was a great influence on me. He was a First World War veteran, and he survived Gallipoli and then the Somme, and obviously came back and had one son, my father, Alan Rose, who's deceased now. And Papa, as we used to know him, was a great influence on me because he would always, I can remember him saying, son, aim for the front of the top of the cow shed, you won't get in the front door. Aim for the moon and you might get over the other side. And, that it rang in my ears. Got to aim high.
Yeah.
Always aim high. And you never know what might be on the other side, what might surprise you, how other people might surprise you, and how you can make best out of sometimes not always the best set of circumstances in front of you.
Yeah. Tell me about your grandfather. Did he, apart from his service career in what you just mentioned, what did he do through his life?
He was a banker. He went to the war. He was a bit of a cheeky old fella. I was going to say a cheeky bugger, but I'm not sure if I can use that language on this show, although I just have.
Why not?
He got himself into the First World War just on 16 years of age, which was not allowed. You had to be 18 years of age, so he falsified his documents. Because in those days, it was an adventure. Go to war was one of those great things. Got on the ship, being seen off at Station Pier here, and then all of a sudden, you're on the other side of the world for this adventure, albeit that adventure was a pretty nasty one, it transpires. He returned, obviously, after quite some time. We wrote a bit of a book about him, my father and I. We went to the centennial celebrations or commiserations of Anzac, the 150th year of Anzac, or 100th year of Anzac. As a result of getting back, he recovered. He was then given a bank position. I'm not sure if he was given, but he ended up working for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia in country Victoria, and then really took up sailing, actually. And
that's where the sailing comes from. I thought it had come out here somewhere.
Yeah, and then became Commodore of Royal St Kilda Yacht Squadron, was the Flying 14 Skiff Squadron at the time. Then it became Royal St Kilda, it's now Royal Melbourne. And he introduced my father to it, and it all went on from there.
Fascinating. So you went to grammar, and then you leave grammar and go straight to do a degree, Cam?
Yeah, I finished off grammar after I didn't actually pass VCE in the end.
Right.
No, I failed. I failed because I failed at English. I got an A in maths and A in, where there was maths A and B in those days. I just did straight maths. We had biology, chemistry, and physics, and I got straight A's in all of those 4 subjects, but failed English, which meant that you got an automatic fail. And so I went from there straight on to Footscray Institute of Technology and did an applied science degree, or Bachelor of Applied Science. And I was very focused on my sailing at the time, and I thought that was a great thing to do because I wanted to get an edge on my sailing capacity. I was fit, I was strong, I was certainly knowledgeable, I had plenty of opportunity to practice. My equipment I would work on, so it was in good condition. So how could I get a physical edge? So I thought, well, go study the sport of science, or science of sport. And that led me to an exercise physiology degree, and I went on from there, and I don't know if it really had that much of an impact in terms of giving me an edge, but it gave me a great understanding of many principles which I've carried through my whole of life.
Cam, how big was that course way back when? I know now I actually have a nephew that had studied it recently, and it's actually one of the more popular courses now. Sports science is something that's very, very big. You look at the contracts that some of these professional athletes are signing these days, and you need to have those sports scientists around them to support these hefty salaries. So way back when you finished high school and went straight to university, or VUT, how many people were doing it back then?
Well, I think we had a course of only about 60 cohort in those days, and it was a nascent industry, really. Training for a VFL club as it was then, there wasn't any AFL, was all about how hard you could flog the players and how hard you could push them until they either broke or just before they broke, and then you backed off a bit. And there wasn't necessarily huge amount
of science to it.
No. Well, that was about it. And there was an application of a whole bunch of new principles in terms of not only taking people's bloods and testing their lactate limits and their VO2 max, their body weight critical mass indexes, their BMI, and reducing fat versus muscle content. They were the beginnings of all of those things, which are now absolutely commonplace, as you say, Dexter. In the sporting world, there are a whole bunch of parameters. They know, how high you can jump, how fast you can run, how quick your beat test is, how quick your lactate levels drop or rise, whether you've got a predisposition to any of those things to make you a natural athlete, a long-term athlete as in an endurance versus a short-term athlete as in sprint fast. And there's a whole world around that. And as you say, it's an industry, huge industry now, which evolves around multiples of tens of millions of dollars. And in fact, the AFL is probably the largest. It is the largest in this country. And certainly, if you go to the US, it's significantly large over there. It's massive.
I just want to draw, Cam, and I'll probably do this a few times in sort of the lessons, because I've, in listening to successful people and I try and get in front of as many successful people to try and learn the lessons. There's always themes of things that, like you said, you did a university course and you've had a hugely successful business career, not related at all to the university course necessarily you've done, but you've been able to, in various parts of your life, draw a lot of lessons. You mentioned that there's a lot of lessons in that university course. What are some of the things that you've applied or learnt from way back then, you sort of like light bulb moments down further in your career?
Yeah, well, you say hugely successful career. I think my career has been successful. Hugely successful.
Don't undersell yourself.
No. I think the day you say hugely successful is probably the day you should stop.
True.
I think that's probably one of the lessons. You keep on learning. The more you do, the more you realise you don't know. The more you need to listen, and the more you need to absorb, and the way the world's changing. I mean, it's quite phenomenal, and that's just a change, death, taxes, and change. 3 things that are going to continue throughout our whole lives. Some of the key lessons, well, there's many. You've got to apply yourself. I think that's been a bit of a theme of this discussion already. Secondly, you've got to know your stuff, and in the event you don't, then you've got to own up you don't, and actually then go about finding out about the stuff you need to know about. I've got an old saying, one of the most difficult people in the world to deal with is someone who doesn't know what they don't know. Because you can't rely on them, because they actually give you advice on things that they don't really know much about. They might have an opinion on something, but when you're in a business environment, if you don't know, then don't give advice on it. Go find out before you give advice.
Seems to be more plentiful now, Cam, than ever. Opinions rather than solid advice. True?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I've had an old saying as well, which is applicable to me. It's been the way I've lived my life. You need a little bit of strategy. A lot of people spend a lot of time strategizing and never really tend to get out of the strategy mode. You need a bit of strategy. You then need to apply that strategy, and that requires a lot of hard work. And if you think a lot of hard work's a lot of hard work, then double it, and you're getting close, and then probably add just a bit more, and that's about right. And then you need a smidgen of luck. And you know what? You go through life and you meet people who are successful, and they tend to always be successful. And people say, "Oh, geez, they got lucky." Some people do genuinely get lucky; they win Tots Lotto. Well, maybe not because they bought the ticket. But there are others. You go, "Oh, they got lucky." If you actually look at who they are and what they've done, they knew where they were going. They put a strategy.
Yeah.
They applied themselves, and they really applied themselves, and they created their own luck. And then they capitalised on that and went again. And that, I think, is probably a formula outside knowledge and expertise, whether it's been accounting, law, engineering, science, medicine, where you've got subject matter expertise. You've got to have that formula of some sort within yourself to be able to make something of those areas of expertise or knowledge.
Interesting. We'll probably dive around in not in linear sections of your career, but talk us through obviously you were the CEO of the Western Bulldogs, or for people that don't know, over a decent stint of time. And I've spoken to a couple of people that have been at various levels of management of sporting organisations, and I think there's a little bit of regret and a little bit of happiness that they did their term, because it's not exactly, you've got all the responsibility in equal to a public organisation, but with that added layer of emotion and a fan base, a membership base. Talk us through that time. And obviously that was, from what I understand, a massive turnaround. You came in at a time where that organisation was struggling financially, the club was struggling financially, and there was a big turnaround. Talk us through that period of time in your professional career.
Yeah, well, I think you've touched on a couple of factors, emotion and passion. And when emotion and passion takes over logical decision-making, you're in trouble. You need to be passionate and sometimes emotional about your decisions and stick to them. But if those two things, passion and emotion, are driving decision-making, then that's a bit of a recipe for disaster. My time at the Bulldogs, the history of the Bulldogs, their woes are well documented, from the fight back from the Peter Gordon era to the supposed merger, fight back from the merger with Fitzroy, the Up You Ross Oakley campaign, the film that was made. There's several books that have been written, and the club really was in a bit of a hopeless, helpless and hapless state when I got there. David Smorgon had taken over from the hard work of Gordon, and the club was really a bit powerless. David had done his very best, and they wanted a gear shift. So I wasn't really looking to work there at all. In fact, I got to take the role on, and I've not made any, haven't hidden it at all, but I hadn't really been to an AFL game in my life before. At the earlier part of this interview, I talked about rugby union was my passion and still is.
Wow. So just talk us through, sorry to interrupt, talk us through how this occurred. I'm fascinated. How did you get to this position?
Well, there was someone who asked me to consider taking on the role, and they were looking, as I said, for a gear shift. And I think they were smart enough to realise doing more of the same wasn't going to bring a different result. So they wanted someone outside the sport who had a sporting understanding and cultural background and had been successful in what they'd previously done. I'd just come off the back of working for Turner Broadcasting Corporation out of the US in Brisbane for a 4-year period. And they wanted someone to come in, I think, without the passion. and without the emotion to help the decision-making of changing the course and the direction of that club. And I've got to say, 9 bit years on, that was probably one of the toughest periods of my time, because you've got, as you say, a very public role where one thing you learn very quickly in AFL, everyone has an opinion and every person's opinion is correct. And you've got to listen to those opinions, but you've got to carve a course of your own. And not belligerently or put your head in the sand and just stick to that course, because you need to begin to pivot or change, direction or adjust. But you've got to plough a course that will bring the community of that football club along, help grow it, and be mindful and respectful of the stakeholders which support you, primarily the AFL and the other, as it was then, 15, now 18 clubs.
It's a balancing act. Two things I want to touch on your time there, and I often, Dex hears me talk about this all the time, is, early on in my career, I believe that communication and relationships are two of the core tenets of, trying to be as successful as possible. And as I said, being in sports administration, firstly, I'll say probably around your era of starting that position, it really brought in a new era of what people are commonly referred to as, CEOs and administrators of sport, of being, outside of that particular sport or outside the industry to bring in a new wave. So I would suggest that you're probably on the precipice of a big wave of that occurring. I think that's probably a fair assumption, and we now see today that that's a common occurrence in terms of, obviously very good administrators and communicators. But just coming back to communication, in a role like that, communication, is amplified. It is in all these CEO roles. I'm, probably presuming that it's important to you too, but you've got internal stakeholders, you've got the fan base and the membership base, you've got the AFL, you've got the media. It's, different to a public company where you've got, or a government organisation, which we'll get to later in your career, where you're much more internalised in terms of the stakeholders. There's this constant news cycle. Talk us about communication in a role like this, and how, you dealt with some pretty big things that occurred, let's be honest, in a negative way during that time. It was things inside and outside of your control. Talk us through the I suppose, the importance of communication and how you handle that in this particular role.
A couple of just the facts to touch on. They may not be quite correct now, but they were in my time. I think when I was there was overall around about 400 accredited photographic media journalists at any one point in time around the whole of the AFL. National Parliament, I think, has about 150. So that shows the level of media scrutiny that is on the AFL, and for that matter, other sports such as NRL and cricket. Communication, to that point, it's all about, and you touched on it, but it's all about people. Football, the leather only gets kicked around by players. Players are people. They get together as a group. They're coached. That's a person. They run through a club which is made up of people. It's led by people, and it's all about people. So unless you've got the ability to not just listen, because a large part of communicating is listening and hearing what people have to say and genuinely understanding what their concerns or benefits or positives are, negatives and positives, and then be able to communicate back that not only have you heard them, but what your strategy, what your plan, what your direction is, why we've taken a particular path, why a particular matter can't be resolved, why a particular idea is a great idea. And I'll give you one example of that. When we're a part of repositioning the Bulldogs, we needed to do some big gear shifts, or, I'll call circuit breaker ideas, things that would literally, circuit break and then give us the ability to restart. One of those, which harked back to my career my education at FIT, now Footscray, or then Footscray Institute of Technology, Victoria University, was to establish a sports science link between the university and the football club. Now, that had never been done before in the AFL. And a lot of people sat on the sidelines and said, what's a university got to do with an AFL football club? People who go to the university follow all sorts of different clubs. What we're trying to imbue our students or enforce on our students that they should follow the Western Bulldogs or Footscray Football Club as it was. And they used all sorts of those arguments to say, why is this not a good thing? Well, it's what it was trying to do, and we need to listen to those concerns, was to use the expertise of the sports science school there, which was one of Australia's, and still is, one of Australia's leading sports science schools, the exercise physiologists, the remedial masseurs, the various forms of intervention from osteotherapy through to myotherapy, physiotherapy to a lesser degree because BU didn't study that or teach that, the various nursing disciplines, to bring those into the centre of the club rather than to the periphery of the club. And as a result of that, that relationship was not only so strong, it's gone on and now being replicated by every other AFL club in the competition.
Commonplace now.
And in fact, you're not a complete football club unless you have a relationship with some form of university or teaching institution at that sports science level.
Yeah.
So, but at the time, it was shuttered down, and it was seen to be, complete diversion of what the core focus, outcomes, deliverables, what the university was. Why would they be siding with one football club? There was not a matter of siding with one football club. It was a matter of a symbiotic, if not synergistic relationship. We had needs that they had the skills of. They needed promotion. They needed publicity. We were both in the same area. We both had similar objectives from that point of view in terms of positioning, promotion. So another thought we had, which has gone on to a lesser degree, was the Western region of Melbourne has not always had the best rap. And it's a phenomenal region of Melbourne. It's been the industrial heartland of Victoria and, in fact, Australia, and it's changing now. But there are some fantastic, iconic institutions in the West that don't get recognised. ScienceWorks, Werribee Zoo, Victoria University, Western Health. So there's a whole range, and the Western Bulldogs. So one of the concepts was we'll bring those iconic institutions together to promote the jewels in the crown of the Western region of Melbourne, of which the university is one, the football club's another. Werribee Zoo is a fantastic facility, under-promoted and not necessarily recognised for what it offers. ScienceWorks is one of the most visited school exhibitions in the whole of the state, and they're all in the West. So that's all about communication. It goes back to your point. All of those organisations are run by people. You've got to have ideas. You've got to be able to share those ideas, get people to understand your ideas, hear their views about them, take that on board, and then come to a common outcome to see if those ideas can actually work and float and be successful.
Okay. Just before we move on from the, I suppose the Western Bulldogs era, obviously you dealt with some like every club goes through their, again, we're dealing with emotion particularly at a player level. We're, dealing with a cohort of young individuals. I'm just talking to some of the potential problems, that particularly in this era, started to get paid a really decent coin. With that becomes, they're not used to it, and it's even more amplified now with more money and social media. But it was, of course, you mentioned the amount of media tracking. So these young kids have got a lot of focus on them, and things can go wrong. Talk us through, obviously at a CEO level, when the wheels fall off the cart a little bit, or in a big way, and they all fall off. What sort of level of involvement does the CEO get to in terms of a player level? Because I often look at some of the, these scandals that have occurred in the past, and obviously coach is there to coach, but then you've got this layer of administration. It's and this applies to all sport, but it's different to a public organisation or a government department. What happens in that sort of a case? And I don't expect you to go into individual examples, or you can if you wish, but talk us through that. Again, I suppose it touches on communication, but I've always been fascinated by the level of involvement and where, administration steps in over the coach, particularly in times where they're not painted, positive by the media.
Yeah, well, look, the crises can occur in all sorts of manner and ways that you mentioned, whether it be players, coaches, or a combination of all of the above. And some of it's mischief making, and others, maybe some of its own cause from the individuals. Well, the first thing you need to do as an administrator or a leader of a business or a CEO is you need to have a crisis management plan. And that crisis management plan articulates in very detailed form what everyone's role, position is in that particular crisis, their function, and what they need to do. And then you need adjunct to that, but with that, a business continuity plan. Because as a crisis occurs, the business still has to continue to go on. And sometimes a crisis will take people out of the business to deal with the crisis. So what's the fallback plan to make sure that the wheels keep turning? And equally, that has to have very clearly defined roles, structures, functions, and people's position whilst that difficulty is being dealt with, while that crisis is being put to bed or sorted or resolved, and the business continues. So with those two things, an administrator has a very clear view as to what their role is. And then you deal with the particular instance and what involves, or who's involved and how that's involved. That requires a very good team, a team that actually understands what their roles are. And as the CEO, I wouldn't necessarily have a lot to do on a day-to-day basis with the players. You know who they are and they know who you are, but their boss is the coaching cohort team led by the coach. And the coach has a specific role to deal with in resolving that conflict. You probably have a role to do as well, depending on the nature of the conflict, whether it has a financial implication, has a media implication. You need to be a spokesman for the club or for the issue that's being dealt with, a supportive role in terms of keeping the institution stuck together in the time of crisis so that it actually doesn't tear itself apart. And then how do you resolve all of that so you can continue on? And clubs are resilient. I think they're probably one of the most resilient institutions you can find because they've got a membership base that is passionately and emotionally involved. They will take a view, but they'll stay with the club as long as things are handled in a reasonable way.
Interesting. I've got one more question, and Dex might have a question on the Western Bulldogs. I mentioned earlier in the chat you turned the club around financially, or had a large part to play in that. Talk us through that process, because obviously you've got the way that and I don't know a lot about this, but I've been involved in a little bit from various parts through my involvement in clubs, is funded from a number of different avenues. Obviously the club wasn't in great shape financially. Talk us through the mechanics of how that turnaround occurred, practically how that happened.
Yeah, well, I think there were three stages to it. You've got to stabilise the operations and make sure you got $1 coming in, you got to spend 98 cents and leave 2 behind. So you got to get the operations within level playing field. They've got to, make sure that you don't spend more than what you earn. That may seem obvious, but not necessarily the simplest thing to do, particularly in an environment where you want to buy players or pay players in order for them to actually be attracted to your club, to get the talent, albeit there is a salary cap, a minimum amount and a maximum amount. All of that requires expenditure. So you've got to stabilise the operations. Secondly, you've got to the second part to it is you've got to look to the stakeholders around you. And that's not just the AFL, it's the other then 16, now 18 clubs. And there was a whole bunch of issues that are structurally wrong with the AFL at that time. I think a lot of them are now being resolved with the ownership of the Marvel, or then Etihad Stadium, by the AFL, where you played games, you might attract a crowd of 30-odd thousand, but you didn't get the financial return, which then didn't allow you to have the cash flow, which then didn't allow you to keep a stable-based operation. So having what was called the Competitive Balance Fund properly established on reasonable footing, on metrics that were measurable and could be clearly seen and transparent, was the second part of that. that then followed in there. You needed to grow membership, you needed to drive sponsorship. So we signed, one of the longest term sponsorships for the Bulldogs, Mission Foods. Juan Gonzalez, who was the owner and managing director of that company, Mexican, who brought Mission Foods to Australia, and other sponsors. And then the third part is you needed something that was going to really give your club a lift and change the culture of the club, change the esprit de corps of the club. Football clubs are all about hope. And unless there's hope that the players are going to do well because you can pay them appropriately, or you can attract them, or that they can recover from injury because they've got the right methodologies and rehab processes around them, that you've got the right membership initiatives, that you've got the right facilities. So you've got to have that package of things. And a couple of those things stood out. One we've talked about was we established the relationship with Victoria University that filled a big void in our club in that area of expertise around rehabilitation, athlete preparation, or player preparation, fitness. The other one was our facilities were really very, very poor. And I think that's been gentle. And as a result, we developed an ambitious plan, and it was very ambitious at the time, to redevelop the Whitten Oval into a new facility that would support the players with an elite learning centre, and then other related facilities to support the administration of the club. And that led to a $32.5 million redevelopment that was supported at the federal government level, at the state government level, at the local government level, a small amount or an amount from the AFL, and then philanthropically, the club itself had to raise a significant amount of money with the support of Victoria University. And that led to probably the big push in my time to, well, the Bulldogs are alive. They're real. They're serious. They've got, and in fact, we went from hopeless, helpless and hapless facilities to actually having the best in the AFL competition at the time, which, with the Victoria University relationship and those facilities, has now become a benchmark for all of the other clubs who then said, oh, we need to upgrade our facilities. And now the Whitten Oval is subsequently going through phase 2 of that redevelopment to actually somewhat keep up with the arms race of the investment in the facilities, which is critical for the development of the players, their rehabilitation, their maintenance, their fitness, and their teaching and education.
It's like Tailwinds, isn't it? You've got to try and turn that corner, get the funds, and then all these things provide tailwinds. And then, you've obviously got facilities and you've got the relationship with the university. You're heading in the right direction. You've got players attracted to you, not purely based on monetary reward. But I suppose, is that also a fair assumption? Because I've got to assume that, yes, money's important to players, but obviously club culture and the tailwind and a place to call home is important to a lot of players.
Yeah, and you call it tailwinds. I think you have a vision, where is the club going, and why is it going there, and who's leading it there, and is that believable? Are those people, can you buy into that story? Communication. But then, as you said, you've got the tailwinds behind you that helped you get on that journey.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the vision, then the tailwinds will just blow you wherever you're pointing. Yeah. You've got to, in our circumstances, we had to create those tailwinds. I mean, when I started the club, we had the lowest membership of the AFL, I think something like 11,200 odd. Now, we've now got, I think, just under 60 odd thousand, which is a significant shift in the time that's been there. Still probably not enough. The club historically wants to grow more. It hasn't had a lot of premierships in its time. 2. But probably one of the best AFL premierships in history was the one in 2016 when we beat Sydney in our fantastic final of the MCG. And that was all a part of, I wasn't there at the time, but that was the foundations that were built that then gave the next crew the ability, with those tailwinds, with the vision, to carry it to the next stage.
Now, Cam, as much as I want to go to the next topic of VicTrack and talking about billions and billions of dollars, I actually want to take a couple of steps back, even actually before the Western Bulldogs. Now, you can take the Western Bulldogs out of the equation based on what we've talking about and basically insert any business in there, because that's what it sounds like to me. Now, you've briefly touched upon this. You went to high school, went to university, studied sports science in a way. Where did you get your business chops from? There's this gap for me that I'm like, okay, you're a sports scientist, and now you're heading, you're chief executive of some of these businesses. Where did you get that knowledge from?
That's an interesting question. A lot of it's innate. A lot of it's common sense. A lot of it has been under the tutorship, leadership, mentorship of others. And a lot of it is experiential learning on the job. I mean, immediately after college, I was fortunate enough outside my sailing career to work for the Victorian government in what was called then the Tobacco Unit, which was the forerunner for the Tobacco Act of 1987, proclaimed, I think, on October the 7th by the then Minister of Health, David White, which then became the Victorian Health Promotion Foundation, and that actually set up the replacement of tobacco advertising in sport in Victoria. And that was an unheard of, that's led to a global movement where you do not see today any tobacco advertising for sport globally. You may probably in some emerging countries, but certainly in all of the major broadcasting companies in motor racing, in cricket, we used to, have the Beds and Hedges cricket tours. None of that exists anymore. So that gave me a taste of, what you needed to do to change things, create change. I went on and worked under a fantastic person, Rhonda Gelbelly, as one of the first employees of the then Vic Health, which was established out of that legislation. And then I was given a really great opportunity to lead the sport of my choice, Sailing State Sporting Association. And all of a sudden I found myself exactly to your point, where were my business skills? P&L, balance sheet, managing cash flow. Yes, we've talked about communication and understanding and listening, but we're all the mechanics of a business. And how do you actually produce a set of accounts? You're responsible for those set of accounts. You're responsible for the P&L. You're responsible for cash flow. You're responsible for getting the income in. Anybody can spend, but getting the income in is, the big issue. And then I went on from there. And again, I was very fortunate, very, very fortunate to work under the late Ron Walker and Jeff Kennett in the Melbourne Major Events Company for that halcyon period where we really focused on bringing events to Melbourne to make Melbourne and we have become so known as certainly the Australian Centre for Sporting Excellence and Australia's capital for sport. And we had some very significant events, the AFL Grand Final and the tennis, as it was known then. I think it was known in those days as the Fort Australian Open. But we didn't have many other events around, and we created a platform and an environment where we could attract both musical, artistic and sporting events that range from the Bledisloe Cup in rugby union that played at the MCG in 1997 for the first time ever outside of New Zealand, Northern States, New South Wales or Queensland, in front of the largest crowd ever of rugby union at the time, just over 97,000. The President's Cup in golf, the Commonwealth Games bid, the sumo wrestling that came to Melbourne, which I see is recently coming again, the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, the Melbourne Fashion Initiative, which has turned into Melbourne Fashion Festival, the World Surf Life Saving Championships, the World Masters Games, and the list went on. And that was another very fast, very rapid fire environment where I learned very quickly a lot of business skills. And, it went from there. It was those formative years where, I was probably, if you didn't get with it quickly, you would have got left behind. And in fact, it was the other way around. I was hopefully leading it.
Were you having fun during this time?
If I look back, yes. At the time, I probably didn't realise it. There were long days, lots of demands, and it was very rapid fire. But if I look back, Yes, had a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
One of the things that another sort of core theme that I look at in terms of, other people interviewing business people and throughout their life, what have you, is there's always someone or a small group of people that have had a big effect on, we spoke about your grandfather and, the effect that he had in your early life, but particularly in your business career, and you mentioned, some pretty high profile names there, Ron Walker and Jeff Kennett, and you mentioned another lady, Rhonda, in your early career. I know for me that I've had someone, particularly, I've had a lot of people, but one person that has been started as a family friend and become, pretty much a very, very close friend, and someone I'd call a second father that has shaped the way I've thought in regards to business and communication, has just been a real sort of guiding light, I suppose, for all the big decisions. Talk us through, for you, who those people have been and why.
Yeah, I don't think I could single out any one individual that has been more than a contributor than another. I think I've had a cocktail of great leaders of varying different styles, from the late Ron Casey, who was very much involved in the Tobacco Act and then the Victorian Health Promotion Foundation, Rhonda Gelbelly, the late Ron Walker, Jeff Kennett, an outstanding leader, irrespective of politics, outstanding leader. Wayne Goss, the late Wayne Goss, I worked directly for him, another outstanding leader, in fact, phenomenal gentleman, and a real loss to see that Wayne's not with us now. A left field person, I didn't have a huge amount of exposure to him, but he was my hero from the America's Cup in 1974 and 70. I think it was 72 and 74 or 76, sailing a boat called Courageous, Ted Turner. And I, as a young boy, followed his success in the America's Cup. I never thought I'd end up meeting him. I ended up meeting him. I ended up working for him. And a man of enormous intellect and vision. Probably not one of the easiest communicators, but someone who was seriously off the wall brilliant. He used to have a saying, which I'll modify a little, but it was, bring me your problems with the solutions, take control, lead, or get out of my XXX way. And you think about that. He was a leader of an organisation. Every organisation's got problems. Bring those problems with solutions. Every problem has a solution, not always the most palatable, the easiest, but you probably know what those solutions are. Take control of the situation, show some leadership, come and seek some guidance, and if you don't, I might as well get rid of you because I'll find someone else who will. And that's been a mantra by which I've lived my life and tried to help others, because you can't do it all by yourself. It requires teams of people, and you've got to get teams together. You've got to imbue them with responsibility and accountability. They've got to feel good about that, whilst you hold them accountable to it, and they've got to be rewarded and recognised for that. So, go on to other names. Bob Annals, who was one of Victoria's probably most, there's many, but recognised public servants. Elizabeth Proust, I had, some time as she was a director of the Melbourne Major Events Company. David Jones of Tattersalls. So John Haddard. So there was a lot of those people who, not one of them jumps out to be, a long-term lasting friend. I could ring them all up, and all those who are still with us, and they'd take my call, and I'm sure they'd hopefully speak kindly of me. Probably my family who's been the ones that, ground you and keep you grounded with, 3 children, and they make sure that your feet are firmly on the ground, and, Dad, you're not ahead of yourself, and are you listening to us?
They'll bring you back to earth pretty quickly, won't they?
They certainly do.
talk us about to your family. Obviously, and we'll get to a few other things, but you've had a big career in government also with VicTrack and what have you. These are, and the Western Bulldogs, and you've been the CEO of Star Alliance Developments and Watersun Homes, and obviously a myriad of things. These are not, you don't, turn up at 9 and leave at 5. They don't come with, easy decisions and all this sort of thing. What's the effect been on you? Because leading a career of that nature, and this might be a bit of a tough question, but has it had an effect on your family, and how have you balanced that?
Yeah, probably not the best, to be honest. And no, it's not an easy question, but honesty is the best answer. And probably my marriage did take a toll, and I ended up separating and divorcing. Now, there are multiple reasons behind all of that, but I think the demands of my work career and probably my focus on it and dedication to it to achieve the outcomes that I wanted to achieve took its toll. So that's, something, if I look back, is probably not one of the things that I, feel the best about. But you've got to learn to live with the circumstances and move forward from that and make the best of what you've got. And I don't regret actually separating. It was probably not the best time for me, but you have to just, as I've said, make the best of what you've got. I've got 3 beautiful children out of it who probably got a bit of my genes in them because they're highly driven and successful already in their own ways.
Yeah, wonderful. Talk us, could you have done anything different? I mean, obviously, doing these roles and, which the hard work and which leads to the success and other opportunities, it is just time, isn't it? I mean, apart from all the other things and surrounding yourself with good people and developing good teams and all that sort of stuff, but you've got to put the hours in. Is there any, I'm in the early stages of still what I consider the early stages of career, own business, a number of, a team of people. You've got to put the hours in, but also I've got, a 3-year-old, 3.5-year-old Leo, who should and demand some of my time. Could you, if you went back in time, is there anything you could have sort of done slightly different? Because I'll tell you one of my challenges, and it's always good to hear perspective that it's someone that has been there and done it, is, I pour a lot of time into my work. But when I do say, okay, I'm going to spend time with family, it's a matter of trying to switch off, and trying to flick the switch is a challenge for me.
You've honed in on what the big issue is. And I don't know, my phone's not with me. I deliberately took it away because they're so intrusive. And they're evil. They're great devices, but they're evil when it comes down to this. And even with kids, would I do something differently? Yes, I would put the phone away and make sure that you do disconnect. Now, you don't necessarily disconnect for 3 days and just disappear, but you do disconnect, and that when you do spend time with those around you who are important, who need your time, you actually, give them that focus and that attention. Go back to your point, building a career. I've got to say, I don't think you can really, well, certainly for me, I don't know I couldn't have built my career without having put the time in. If you want to be an athlete, you've got to put the time in. If you want to be an exceptional athlete, you've got to put a lot of time in. And that time may not always be, lifting weights or running faster or getting your heart rate up. It may be resting. It may be sleeping. It may be rehabilitation. It may be massage. It may be manipulative therapy. You've got to be focused on your task. Business is exactly the same. And there are things that need to get sacrificed along the way. You do need to make choice. However, family is critical and important, and at the end of the day, it's probably the only thing that's going to be looking at you when you're in your final hours. So you need to somehow find the balance to be able to disconnect and spend, there's the argument, quality time, not necessarily quantity of time. I think there's a balance, and you've got to be able to spend both quality time but also quantity of it in certain areas. And I mean, I see it. I was a victim of it. You'd go watch your kids on the playing field and you'd have your phone with you, and, the phone would ring and you'd take a call.
Yeah.
Did you need to do that on Saturday? in retrospect, was that the right thing to have done? And probably a lesson from me, if I can share with others, is, did that call really matter? Could have it waited till another time? And the answer is probably most likely yes. And the signals you sent to either your partner or your children, if they saw, was not the right necessarily signal that you're interested in them and their activity and their interests. And so that's probably something that I would change. I'm not sure I could change the amount of time I had to put into work, though.
No. And I think that is, I was talking to someone hugely successful in the property world a few days ago, without naming names, but, he sort of echoed similar comments. But what he did say is the time that he did put in, he's 3 kids also, is all his 3 kids are emerging and making a success of their own lives, is that they did see in their dad a very strong work ethic through just doing. And, it accounts for so much is the act of that. So, there is, I suppose, to take away some positives as I cling on to them as, the work put in, it is. You've also spent a lot of time in government, VicTrack. Another thing that I'm really, really interested, talk us through that time, but these are very different organisations that you've led, Star Alliance Developments and Watersun Homes and VicTrack. What's the big differences in government as opposed to a private organisation? Is there, from a leadership perspective?
Sorry, the last question you just fell out a bit. Sorry.
Yeah. So in terms of the big differences between government and private enterprise, what are the big differences in terms of from a leadership perspective leading those organisations? Because government, I'd imagine, is a totally different kettle of fish.
Very much so, and it's got a lot of rules and boundaries around it that you don't normally have or wouldn't have in private enterprise, whether it be large private enterprise or small private enterprise. But the principles are the same. You've got to understand who your stakeholders are. You've got to understand clearly what their needs and drivers are, what their wants or outputs are expected of you. You've got to have strong business acumen and related principles. You've got to then bring all that together and drive an organisation which is often driven by a policy agenda, not necessarily a financial agenda. VicTrack was an interesting organisation because it had a bit of a mixture of both. It had very clear policy outcomes or deliverables of the government in terms of some of the things we see today, the level crossing removals, the metro tunnel, the significant upgrades in much of the Victorian transport infrastructure, of which is very, very much needed and will continue to be needed as our population grows. But on the other hand, you've got to keep the operation financially viable. And VicTrack was a bit of I don't want to say an anomaly organisation, but it was an organisation that's unusual. It was an asset base of all of the below rail and above rail infrastructure. So what does that mean? It's the land on which the rail corridor sits or is in the rail corridor, all of the infrastructure that goes on top of that, the rail, the overhead cabling systems, the stanchions, the ballast, the sleepers, the rails itself, and then the below infrastructure, which is the telecommunications infrastructure that's required to run a rail system. And then on top of that, you've got the rolling stock, and then you've got a whole range of other related assets because it also includes the tram network that we have in Victoria. So you bring all those assets together and you've got a very large asset-based organisation, which has then got a number of challenging contracts where those assets are leased out to a franchise operator. And that operator then has the responsibility of maintaining those assets and running those assets in order to provide the service where we as public expect them to be delivered to. And that's then a natural position of challenge because the more you use the asset, the more that needs to be put back into it to keep in the condition that we expect. And how is that done and who determines those conditions and how do you drive revenue from that to reinvest back in? And that's the policy agenda versus just the pure commercial outcomes.
How big an organisation are we talking, VicTrack, Cam? Just out of interest. What in terms of government is.
It's not the biggest by any means. In terms of couple of facts about VicTrack. Its balance sheets would have changed now. I haven't seen the latest annual report, but it'd be somewhere around in the order of $60 billion worth of assets. It's the largest titled landowner in Australia.
Oh, wow.
So people probably didn't appreciate that our forebearers, when they laid the rail corridor, they realised that that rail corridor was going to be particularly valuable, and they actually titled it under the Torrance titling system, which means it's got a folio number and coordinates and a piece of paper that actually puts it in the name of VicTrack. It runs Victoria's largest single-owned telecommunications optic fibre network that runs along the full length of that rail corridor into metropolitan and country areas. And it's got ownership of all the rolling stock. So that adds up to that, that number of 60-odd bill of assets. And then it's got a revenue stream that varies depending upon what assets it's engaging either in the market to lease, sell, or develop in some fashion. Got about 400, maybe 450 employees, and its turnover would be a couple hundred mil. Maybe not that exactly now, but thereabouts.
So, Cam, give us an example of a week at your peak, heading VicTrack. What are the sort of decisions that you made, fires that you put out, dealing with different entities? Give us an example of a typical week.
Well, typical week, I was always an early starter, always have been. Doesn't seem to have left my blood. I was up this morning, excited about this. And I was up this morning at about 4:30. That seems to be my stock standard way. I'd be in the office early, get on top of your emails, and then work out what were the meetings for the week. You'd actually do that the week before in preparation for the week. And then you'd have the various parts. And it would be broken into, I think, multiple sections. You've got the administration of the organisation and its key objectives, its various committees that lead to its board meeting, which would be on a monthly cycle. So you've got to run that side of the agenda, which is the preparation of the papers, the key decisions that need to go to the board, the tracking of the KPIs that the board has set, and the progress to those. You've then got to make sure you work to the stakeholders, and that's primarily the Minister for Transport, who drives the key objectives and deliverables outside of that to the board, but also directly into the organisation. So you've got to be mindful of those meetings. And then you've got to get on with the business, which is the day-to-day of employing people, dealing with challenging issues. There's someone who, we had some, very challenging issues. I think we had 3 or 4 people in my time who, under, sometimes quite extraordinary circumstances, just didn't come in on Monday because they weren't alive. And you've got to deal with the challenges of that. 1 minute you're speaking to them on the weekend or on Friday, and the next minute on Monday they're not here anymore, and the impact that has on the staff, the impact that why and how, and I'm not going to go into those set of circumstances, but that's difficult. You've then got other decisions like where do you put your resources. The organisation of VicTrack has limited resources and it has enormous demand, some of them we just talked about earlier. So where do you prioritise? How do you prioritise? And some of your GMs or EGMs, executive general managers, are better advocates than others. So just because they're better advocates, do they get the money? Is that what the highest priorities are? How do you actually filter through that to get the best outcome for the organisation in accordance with your objectives and your KPIs? And then you've got to deal with all sorts of myriad of things. Customer complaints, people say this is not happening. You've got other stakers like the Public Transport Ombudsman, and issues that get raised with them that they get raised back with you. You've got to deal with the franchise operators. The list can go on.
Kim, you mentioned a few things. Obviously, they're dealing with some pretty big issues, and obviously you can look back at all the obviously the issues at the Western Bulldogs and other organisations. But I'd imagine the having to deal with ones the loss of life and all that comes with it is hugely challenging. And one thing that as CEOs and administrators is, and rightly so, it's a matter of trying to deal with, well, not deal with, but, guide organisations and individuals through the stresses of life and the stresses of business. But often what I think, and this is from asking a number of people, is, the CEO of an organisation, take Western Bulldogs, it's, you're fronting up every day, particularly in, times of crisis management. Not a lot of focus has been put on your level of mental health, which is a challenge, fronting up and having to be the bearer of bad news, and in whatever organisation, it takes a toll. How have you dealt with the stresses of business over the years, and has it changed for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've probably just absorbed them internally. You try not to bring them home. That's not helpful. Exercise is a critical part of that gives you the ability to let off a bit of steam, but also just realign everything in your brain. The physiological process of getting your heart rate up and focusing on, certain parts of your body that might hurt rather than parts of your head as a result of decisions you've just had to make or impart on others. And over time, I suppose you do talk about them to, very, very select and discreet handful of people, but only very, very few. I could count 2 people, and it wouldn't be necessarily immediate. I think the other thing is that you do work with your board and you use them as a sounding board. So, there's delegation of authority and separation of duty. And so you need to be mindful of that. But equally, the board are there because they've got experience, they've got knowledge in other areas. They may have seen some of these circumstances before or something adjacent to it. And so where appropriate, you would seek guidance and advice to help your decision-making. That may not necessarily help your mental health, might challenge it sometimes. But at least it gives you some guidance that you can go home and think, well, I did make the right decision, or the decision I was going to make needs to be thought through even further. One thing I really haven't had is, if you like, a mentor through my life. I've had many mentors. I talked about them earlier, and you asked, was there one, couple of people who have guided me? There's been many over my journey. And I suppose in a way it's because I've been my own man and my own person, which is probably reflected in my career.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, everyone deals with it, and I think it's like seeking advice from whether it be a board or what have you, or that individual. You mentioned maybe not that individual, but it's a lot of it for me is seeking perspective, isn't it? Whether it's an individual situation and how they have dealt with it, and younger or older. I found it, and as I said, for me, it's been a particular individual that I've sought counsel and guidance from that is been, but for others, it's a number of people. But I think it's good these days that I think that the whole movement of mental health, in terms of at a business perspective, is just being aware of it and sort of being a little bit attuned to it. I think, wasn't around, but I presume years ago it was like, just try and block it out. The advice was block it out and move on, power on. It's changed now, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think you've got to recognise that the way you deal with things may not be the way others do.
Yeah.
And the old saying is, just toughen up, go chew on some concrete. That doesn't cut it these days. And not that you would have ever gone chewed on some concrete. You might have toughened up. But you've got to be more mindful. It's very interesting. Wayne Bennett, who's been one of the most successful coaches in rugby league, says that the players that he coaches today, I'm not sure which team he's coaching at the moment, but if you go back to when he was the Suns, Gold Coast Suns, no, what's
not the Suns, the Redcliffe.
Yeah.
Yep, the new team.
Right.
Yep.
If you go back to his days when he was coach of the Broncos, he would say that, there was a lot of tough love, and the players, got served up a lot of tough love. These days, if you treated the players in the same way as you did back then, you would not elicit the best response. Now, whether that means that the players wouldn't respond, or whether they'd break, or whether they just basically say, thanks very much, but, up yours and go do something different? I'm not exactly sure. But he's recognised the environment we're in today has shifted dramatically, and you cannot operate the same way you did either in language or the way you are as a person without necessarily having the right level of empathy and understanding of how others feel and respond to the way you behave. You just won't cut it.
Cam, I just have a couple of questions around leadership. Listening to you so far, and again, thank you very much for this. Like, some of the insights you've shared are awesome. Do you think that you were born a leader, or at some point in your life, whether it be schooling or through business, that you stood up and thought to yourself, I want to become a leader? Or did you get to a point where people were just suddenly asking you questions and then you thought to yourself, actually, maybe I am a leader?
Well, it's interesting because you've used the word leader 3 times, and I don't think I ever saw myself as that. It just happened. And I can cite a couple of examples that probably meant that I was a leader, but there was a fellow who will remain nameless at school who, for whatever reason, was just relentlessly picked on by a cohort of kids at school. And I remember this guy, there was nothing wrong with him, but he was just unfortunately picked on. And for whatever reason, it went too far one day, and I don't know why. I didn't make a conscious decision. Well, I did actually, but I don't know. It just innately came to me, this is not fair, this is not good enough, this is not right. And so I stood up for this kid, and I was bigger and stronger and broader, and probably a little bit overweight at that time. And it was, if you continue to do that, then you might as well do it to me, and you're going to have to deal with me. And that had an impact, not just on that fellow, but it had an impact on those others who really were picking on the vulnerable. I don't know that I decided to become a leader. It just happened. I can cite another example where we were in Singapore, and for whatever reason, you got one of those massive downpours, like massive downpours, raindrops this big. And all of a sudden, the water just was building up on the footpath, like this, to the point where the footpath's a river. And for whatever reason, in this particular hotel we're in, the gutters overflowed into the foyer of the hotel, into the ceiling, and then the plaster broke, and then the waterfall came into the hotel. And we had all of these hoteliers running around not wanting to do, because it wasn't just like a bucket of water. It was more than a fire hose. It was like 10 fire hoses. And, someone brought a broom, was trying to sweep the water out. Someone brought a vacuum, one of those water vacuums that you could try and I just put my head in the hand. And then someone brought a sheet and threw a sheet, on the water as it was moving over the tiling towards the carpet. And I don't know how or why, but I just remember going to the person who had all these sheets and said, get on the end of the sheet and hold it. That was hard enough just to get them to do that. And then we started to turn the sheet to make it into a roll, and then we could put a roll on the ground that would actually form a bit of a dam wall to stop the impedance of the water. And I remember all of a sudden people just stood back. I actually watched it for a bit to realise the situation was completely hopeless before I did this. And then all of a sudden people started to then follow, and then other people started to get the sheets and roll them up, and all of a sudden we had a nice dam wall being made, and then the rain stopped, and then they could start squeegeeing it out the door. Did that make me a leader? I don't know. It just happened. I didn't ask for it. I didn't. And when it was finished, thanks, guys. I've got to get off and do my next thing. So, and then I think probably what happens is people see you do those type of things and they think, oh, he'd be capable here, or we need someone of that nature to help us in this set of circumstance. It's really, if I had to capture my life in a saying or a statement, it's been a life of extraordinary circumstances where I haven't really, put myself forward in this latter part of my life. I'm changing direction I'm going, but I haven't really, up until now, had to put myself forward for leadership roles. Someone's come along and said, would you consider doing this? or we'd like you to do that, or we want you to come and help us drive this outcome. And it's been, one of those things that's been extraordinary circumstances. It's one thing's led to another, which has led to another, without necessarily having, albeit in business, I've had very clear objectives, strategic outcome, vision, direction. I haven't necessarily had that in my personal career as such.
So, Cam, what 2024? Talk us through where you're at in your professional career and what you're doing.
I think you said, Tom, 2024, where am I at?
Yeah, and what are you doing? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Well, clocking around to close to 60, it's time for that next phase of my life, probably the third and final act, in a work sense. You hear people talk about the third act, and I think I'm just entering that third act. I certainly don't feel 60. I probably look it, but I don't feel it. I feel more like I'm a 20. No, 20s. No. I'm probably more like a 40, 45-year-old. It's certainly in my thinking and the way I move around.
Yeah, great.
Pardon?
Yeah, no. I mean, you can't enter the third phase unless you're feeling like you can.
Yeah,
and it's
absolutely
important, isn't it? You can't. Like if you're 60 and you're feeling 70, 75, it ain't going to happen.
No. So it's what I'm calling the decade ahead as the decade of wisdom, the decade of sharing, and the decade of helping others. And that's in a probably not. If the right opportunity arose, I may take it on, but it's in a more of a non-executive director or advisory capacity, and to see how I can help evolve others through their journey, share my experiences, maybe be that mentor that I didn't have that they are looking for. Mentors in my day weren't even talked about. Business coaches certainly weren't talked about, but there's a whole opportunity out there for that, and that's the direction for me for 24 and beyond.
Exciting. I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there that would love to seek the guidance and mentorship and counsel, because it's transformation. Whether that's in a one person sense for someone, or as you've had a number of people, it is transformational. You see young people. I've seen young people looking at seeking guidance from people. You see them in their career, and then all of a sudden they seek, they align themselves to someone, or they seek some help from someone. I always try and guide the younger people in our organisations to, seek advice. It's okay not to know it all, and it's amazing the trajectory that people go on. If it's a bit of life advice or professional advice, the world's your oyster. So I hope that people seek out your guidance, or you've got people, because it's it's not necessarily just apart from you, Cam, and people like you. It comes from all avenues of people, doesn't it? It doesn't have to be the super successful people. I listened to a fascinating story about someone. Hugely successful US hedge fund manager in the States on a podcast, and he was saying that someone that was truly, very iconic in his life, I suppose, for want of a better term, was someone that lived next door to him who worked for US government, but had hugely strong morals. Wasn't hugely successful in a business career, but was that. So it's not just business; it's just life advice, I think. So.
Tom, along those lines, success is not what it's necessarily all about. In fact, you learn more from your failures than from your successes.
Yeah.
And I think more importantly, and disappointingly, I think in this country, success is held up and failure is shunned. You want to know about where you failed. Failure is natural. You can't grow unless you fail. Failure should be embraced, celebrated. Because if you fail, you learn. And when you learn, then you've grown as a person. Success, you grow to a certain degree, but I think you grow a lot more from failure. And I think that we play too much focus on success. And, it's all about, one of the interesting things, and probably we're coming to a bit of a conclusion, that when I'm interviewing someone, I say, tell us about what's one of the greatest failures in your life. And that, to a word, stumps absolutely everybody. Because then the question is, personal or professional? Well, you answer. I ask the question, you choose. And it's from the failure, what you did, how did you recover, what did you learn, and what would you do next time differently? And they're the things that you really grow from. Success follows that.
Tom, do you have any more questions? Cam, thank you so much so far.
I've only got one other question, Cam, and it's actually what I just mentioned. A podcast by Patrick O'Shaughnessy, who interviews a lot of successful investment and hedge fund managers and what have you. It's one of my favourite podcasts, and I'm going to steal his last question because I think it's a fascinating question, and and it's a nice way to end. And the question is, what is the nicest and most kind thing that someone has ever done for you? It's a hard one. It's a hard one.
That really is a hard one. Wow, I've got to think about that. It was Ted Turner, who I met by happenstance. He was one of my heroes as a young boy. I had him pinned up on the wall in my bedroom at home. And I got a call from him once, and he offered me a job after having met with him many, many years earlier. And the impression that I'd made on him when we met stuck with him, and he recalled the conversation we had. And he rang multiple years later and remember that conversation we had, Cam? Yeah, I do. He said, well, I'd like to have a discussion with you about an opportunity.
Wow.
Now, it wasn't the opportunity. It was the fact that he remembered the exchange that we had had.
Yeah.
And he brought that back into the conversation. So in terms of kindness, he wasn't giving me anything. And he did offer me a job eventually. It actually happened pretty quickly. But it was the fact that he remembered the exchange we had, and he brought that back. And that meant so much to me. And that was a gesture of goodwill and kindness to me.
It's interesting, Cam. In all the people that answer that question on this particular podcast, I'd have to check, but most of the time it's not things that, someone's given you, or it's the things that people have done or remembered, or, been inadvertently kind, and then, the reflection some years later. So it's interesting that same theme was with you. But look, hugely appreciative, a fascinating career. We could talk for hours. I'd love to, talk to you in more depth in regards to the sailing component and all this. And we missed, a lot of things, but I usually appreciate coming on. This whole series is about interviewing people that, have been lived a varied life of various leadership and all those sorts of things. And I'm hugely appreciative of your time and coming on.